Thank you very much for accepting the invitation for the interview. Now, when I did my research on improvisation, improvisation is often associated with theater and music and dance and arts. If I looked into practice, it's often associated with applied improvisation and the applied improvisation network. But when I looked in theories and in research, it's often coming the word organizational improvisation. And in this field, there was one name that popped up very often, and this name was Cunha. So I thought, well, I should try to ask him some questions. So it's great that you have time. And the first question is, could you introduce yourself and your area of research?
Yes, of course. So first of all, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure. I think that the improvisation community is relatively small, and being in touch with people interested in the topic is certainly a good way to enrich the network. Introducing myself. I'm from Lisbon. I'm here, so I work at Nova School of Business and Economics. As I mentioned before, this is the campus, our campus. I did a PhD in marketing, and this is relevant for a reason that I will explain in a minute. I studied in the Netherlands at Tilburg University, and my PhD was on the topic of new product development. I was studying the financial sector in Portugal, banks and insurance companies, and at the time I was using a model that is I think still the dominant model in new product development, which is a model created by an author called Robert Cooper, in which he says that that to develop successful new products, what you have to do is to follow a number of steps. So step 1, step 2, until step 7 or 8. And after each step, you make a decision, go, no go. And this is the model. So the idea is, if you do it right, so in other words, if you follow these 7 or 8 steps, you have a winning product. And I approached companies with this model and with a questionnaire to understand how they develop their new products. And I received from the majority of them the idea that, look, this is not how we develop new products, right? We do it in a much more free way, if you want. So we don't go from step 1 to step 2. So we look at the market, we try to understand what other banks are doing, we try to find new opportunities, and then you try to do things as fast as you can. And on the one hand, this was very disappointing, because if you are doing a PhD and people start complaining about your model, I don't think it's very promising for a thesis. But on the other hand, it created this impression that apparently life in real organizations was very different from life in the model of Robert Cooper. And this created in me the interest for the topic of improvisation. So that's where it started. And at the time, I read a paper by 2 American authors, David Bastian and Ostager, in which they compared innovation to jazz improvisation. And I said, wow, this is what people are telling me. So this is what I need to do. So at the time, I decided to be pragmatic. I finished my PhD with the very linear model. I defended the thesis, and I said, no more. And that's where my passion for improvisation started. And it's still one of the topics that I'm doing as we speak. Now I'm not working in the context of new product development in banks, but I have a paper submitted regarding the big wildfires that took place in Portugal 2 or 3 years ago. And this was a case in which there was an element of improvisation that was terribly wrong. And we want to avoid being too romantic about improvisation, because it can be good, but it can also go very wrong. So this paper is under review. We need to resubmit it. And I have just last week with some colleagues, we have proposed a special issue for a journal on COVID as the locomotive of huge improvisation efforts across the globe. So I think it's a great topic, and I suppose that the pandemic will help to create a boost for the topic of improvisation, because I think we are all improvising to some extent, as we are doing now, right? So that's where my interest for improvisation started. Now I'm a professor. Just to say what I'm doing, I'm a professor at Nova, and basically that's it. You are all invited to come and visit us.
And I've heard that your university is close by the beach, so that's even...
Yes. You bring your surfboard and you'll have a good time. So that is more than improvisation.
So surfing is also improvisation, because every wave is different. But how do you define improvisation? What is improvisation from a theoretical or from a management point of view?
I think that there's this definition that I love because it's very, very simple and accurate, which was advanced by Ann Miner and Christine Morman in one of their papers. And they define improvisation in organizations as the convergence of planning and execution, meaning that you are improvising when temporally these two facets converge. So you are planning and executing at the same time. And in one of the papers I wrote with my colleagues, we define improvisation as action that is deliberate, but not planned, because you didn't have a plan, and that you conduct with the resources at hand, meaning that because you don't have time to prepare or to plan, you have to do things or to get things done with the things you have at hand, which means that in our definition, there is an element of bricolage in improvisation. But I think that what defines improvisation is the temporal convergence of planning and improvisation, the fact that you have to do something novel in the sense that you are deviating from something that you already know, and you have to do it with the things you have. So there's no time to find the adequate resources. So in a sense, metaphorically speaking, I think that you can see improvisation as something very close to what MacGyver does. So you have to solve a problem, you use the stuff you have, you solve the problem, and that's it.
I loved it because MacGyver was one of my heroes.
Yeah, makes sense, right?
And he's a great improviser. Now, in organizations, often managers say, if you do not plan accurately, then you have to improvise. So improvisation is dysfunctional, Is that in your case also a dysfunctional thing, or can you do it, as you said, deliberately?
I think that's, first of all, I have nothing against planning. And I don't think that you don't have to plan because you can improvise. I don't think that's a winning solution. I think that improvisation is a complement to planning, for a very simple reason. We know that you can plan whatever you want, but the world will surprise you. And in this sense, no matter how careful, how rigorous the plans are, you still have to improvise, because the competitors will try to surprise you. You have a plan and suddenly you have a virus. So I think that the world is full of surprise, and in this sense you cannot improvise. So I don't think that, I don't want to be romantic about improvisation. And as I mentioned before, what we are studying in the specific case of this big fire in Portugal is an instance of improvisation that failed. People tried to do the best they could, but it was not enough. And in fact, their improvisation ended up being part of the problem. But I don't want also to be too romantic about plans, because if you plan and if you are too rigid in the application of plans, then probably you are going to miss opportunities, because you don't have the flexibility to plan. So one of the things that I'm writing about the COVID, and as you can imagine, the COVID is a great moment to try to expand knowledge about COVID. I think that if you look at national cases, and please be kind with my thought experiment, because my data are actually very shallow. But if you think about the cases that have been handled well, I think that these are the cases in which you can see lots of planning and lots of improvisation. If you think about the case of Taiwan, and I think that Taiwan was probably one of the countries in which the pandemic was better managed. a center, a center for the control of epidemics or something like that. And this center exists on a permanent basis, so they are constantly trying to counter the probability of a pandemic. But there's one thing they know about pandemics, and this thing is that you can know a lot about pandemics, but you cannot know everything, which means that you need to have the plans, but you also need to have very fast responses. And there's a paper, and in case you're interested, and in case you are all interested, I can then share the reference with Lucas. It was a paper published in a medical journal just a couple of months ago. And according to this paper, this center conducted something like 120 or something like that measures in the very first month of the pandemic in Taiwan. 120 measures, it's a lot. And I think that they have been able to do it because they had planned, which means that even to improvise, you need to be prepared. So I think there's a winning combination, which is preparedness. You need to prepare, and if you combine preparedness with improvisation, that's I think the winning solution. And then you can see cases of countries in which there was a lot of planning, but also a lot of rigidity, which is apparently the case of China, because some agents were very concerned about the reaction of authorities. So you have to follow the rules, and at the end, I think this is one of the possible explanations for the lack of speed of the response. So people, I mean, the local or regional health officers in Wuhan, they were scared about the reactions of the officers. And then you have the case of the US, in which, as you know, there was the planning apparently was not that good. And then you have Trump that is not even trying to improvise. So it's the worst possible combination. So I think that improvisation is not a panacea, but planning is not a panacea either. And in a sense, you know, I think that probably you need both, and the good combination is one in which you have both the plans and you have the preparedness, and you have the improvisation. Just about plans, probably you know this very famous quote from the great theorist Mike Tyson. You know, the boxing star, and Mike Tyson once said that everybody has a plan until they are hit with a punch in their face, and then I think you can see the limits of planning, right? So, but you know, again, you know, I don't think we need to lionize plans or improvisation. They both have their role, I think.
Now, last year we thought about situations in which organizations and people have to improvise, and we thought about innovation and product development and so on. Now, the last 3 months, I cannot imagine a single organization that does not have to improvise. Now, many organizations did not prepare for that. They're not prepared to improvise, to adapt accordingly to the situation. And there will be a next wave coming. It's COVID or another one or whatever is coming. So there will be more surprises, obviously. And the question is, as you said, the preparation. How can an organization and people be prepared for unexpected situations or surprises, as you said?
Yeah. Well, we know that managing the unexpected is difficult because you cannot expect it, so you cannot plan, which means that in terms of emergency management, there's this paradox. You want to manage things that you cannot manage because you don't know when they will happen, how they will happen, etc. But there's one thing we know. In some cases, we have warning signals. And the problem is that a number of organizations are not able to read warning signals. And in some cases, we prefer to ignore them. And there was a very beautiful piece published in the Financial Times by Tim Hartford on the case of the Katrina hurricane in New Orleans. What is surprising about the case is that the case is surprising because there were a number of very, very clear warning signals. So apparently, we believe that we tend to be sometimes excessively optimistic, and the idea is that it was almost there, but nothing happened, which means that the system is resilient, and we can be prepared, etc. I think that one of the lessons of this crisis is that probably it will be wise for organizations to engage more with crisis management, not as something that happens in a crisis, but as something that happens before a crisis. So the question is, how can we think about threats, dangers? How can we prepare scenarios? And I think that scenario thinking is probably a very good tool. And in this sense, I think, of course, the unpredictable will always be unpredictable, but some patterns of unexpectedness can actually be anticipated. So the question is, what can we do to anticipate them? I'm collecting data for a paper on how these two facets combine, preparation and improvisation. And one of the people we interviewed, we are talking with top managers in their respective companies, and one of them said that, well, for us, it's in telco. He said that, well, for us, it was not that complicated because 3 years ago, we prepared for emergencies of different types. So there was a manual. So we went basically to the manual and we did what the manual said, and it was actually quite easy. This was the exception rather than the rule. So I think that the case is very clear. So instead of thinking that these things don't happen, so I think that it's probably better to assume them. And if you allow me to go back to the case of Taiwan, one of the reasons why apparently Taiwan was very successful in coping with this disaster through improvisation was because of SARS. So these countries learned that these things happen, and they were more prepared because they know that it's likely that these type of processes will also happen in the future. Apparently, the same is also valid for the case of Vietnam. I don't know if you are aware of the number of deaths in Vietnam, but the official numbers, and these are the official numbers, so I make no claims about the veracity, but the official numbers say that 0 people died in Vietnam. And the number is so strange that even, I think one of the biggest German newspapers went there to do some fact checking, and they discovered that there's no reason to think that they are making the numbers. And apparently one of the reasons why Vietnam was so effective in combating COVID was because of SARS again. So apparently these people learn. So we need to do things. And when things happen, you need to do them very, very fast. Because if you don't do it fast, then there's no point in doing it. And what we see in Europe is that the cases in which the reactions have been worse are those cases like Italy, in which apparently the initial reaction was very hesitant. And in the case of Spain, in which because of regional divisions between the different nations in Spain, like Catalonia, etc., they impeded a fast action because people were discussing what to do. And if you are discussing what to do, of course you can improvise, but probably you'll do it at a very later stage.
Now, we talked about organization and countries. What about the people, like managers or employees? What do you think? What kind of mindset, what kind of skill set could help them to manage and to deal with the unforeseen?
I think that's, well, the unforeseen. Now let's not talk about a pandemic, but about a trivial unseen. Like, for example, something that was supposed to go wrong and to go right and went wrong. A customer that is making some kind of unexpected claim, whatever. There's this notion, and I think that probably this is one of the most important, maybe the most central notion in my understanding in the case of improvisation, which is the notion of simple structures. Different people give it different names, like semi-structure, simple structure, but the idea is that instead of having systems that are very, very rigid, let's assume that what you need to have a flexible system, flexible and organized system, is to have a combination of rules and freedom. And what we know from a number of organizations is that normally these are a few small rules. And the idea is that with a few small rules, or a few big rules if you want, big in the sense that you don't have many rules, but you have to follow these few rules you have. You need to make sure that the rules are the right ones, but I think that this gives a combination of coordination, and people need to be coordinated, but also freedom, which means that you feel that you have been empowered to do what it takes to solve a problem. I think that the problem with improvisation in many organizations has to do with the fact that people do not feel empowered to do something that was not predicted, prescribed, regulated, routinized, etc. And then We all know what happens in state bureaucracies. You have a problem and nobody can solve the problem because, you know, it's not with me. We have a rule. You have to write, whatever. In other organizations, people have been empowered to respond to problems as they pop up, which means that you feel that you have the space to improvise. And even if the improvisation goes wrong, you feel that you are not going to be blamed if you try to do your best. And you can find these type of rules in different organizations. So that's the case of the very famous Ritz-Carlton hotel chain, in which people have freedom to spend money to respond to customer requests, and you don't have to ask permission to spend this money. And there's a case that I recommend. It's a company here in the Lisbon area called OutSystems, and they have this beautiful manual that they give to new employees, which is called the small book of the few big rules. You can just download it from the internet. And what they say is that, well, welcome to OutSystems, and these are the rules. These rules you have to respect. I think they have 7. These rules you have to respect. If it's not in the rules, use your common sense. But again, it's 7 rules. And I think that that's the type of approach that you need if you want to promote an environment in which people think that I can do whatever it takes to solve a problem. Of course, this is very rare, as we all know.
Now, we do not know what will happen in the future, but what is your estimation? Will there be more surprises for people and organization, or will it be more routines and more clear structures in the next years?
Well. Of course, I have no idea, but let me speculate. I think that a number of organizations are trying to become more agile. So the notion of agility, I think, is very close to the notion of improvisation, because I think that to go agile, you have to assume that people will have leeway or space to do their own thing. In other words, being agile means that you cannot go through the whole hierarchical chain to be allowed to do something. So I think that if the trend towards agility goes deep, then I think that organizations will have to assume that we need to allow people to improvise. You don't have to call it improvisation, because improvisation, I think, is a word that most organizations will try to avoid. You can say that we are empowering people, or creating agility, or going more flexible, whatever. But on the other hand, I think that in spite of the fashion, a number of leaders I know, or managers I know, and I think that my experience is probably not that different from yours. I think that for the majority of managers, feeling that you are not in control is a terrible threat. So if you want to make sure that you are in control, I think that in that case, probably the good old bureaucracy will prevail, because there's no better way of making sure that you are in control than creating a process that admits no deviations. So I think that, you know, probably this will not change that much. In other words, and just to conclude, I think that we tend to assume that the world is stable, but the fact is that the world is full of change. So the world is change, and in this sense, I think that surprises will continue. And if the world is still going to be global, then, as we have seen, a virus starts in Wuhan, which is a city that the majority of us have never heard of before. And suddenly, what started in Wuhan is in your hometown or in my hometown, which means that the potential for surprises increases as we go more global, because all the travel, all the supply chains, they are so interconnected, and the system is so tightly coupled that it propagates surprises all the way down. So I wouldn't expect the world to become more predictable.